Hi friends, and welcome to my compost bin. Today we are talking all things compost. If you follow me on Instagram, I did talk a bit about my compost bin last week or the week before. I have been working on it and I kind of wanted to show you my setup and how you can compost in your backyard, even if you have a very small garden, even if you're just composting for your indoor plants. It's a really great way for you to be able to pack nutrients into your soil and really build the soil structure of your garden. So I have a pretty extensively large garden, and so we compost a lot. I keep this bucket in my kitchen with a lid on top, and I always am putting all of our scraps in here. Things like extra veggie top. If I'm peeling carrots, I put all the stuff in here. Any spent lettuce, anything really that comes from the earth, I end up putting back in here. Also, I put paper in here, especially the paper that doesn't have the shininess on it. If you have a magazine that has that shiny film on it, I definitely would not put that in there. But any other paper I put in here, cardboard that doesn't have any plastic on it, especially like lightweight cardboard. My tomatoes that I get from the store come in this little kind of cardboard container. I put that in here. We put all our ashes from our fire. I put peelings from onions and garlic. I put all of my egg shells back into my compost. I'm going to give you a little look of what my compost looks like. So as you can see, this is my freshest compost that still is breaking down. And you can see a lot of the stuff on top that I have. The chickens really want it. They want to come in here. I put manure in here from our cows. I put leaves in here from the fall. Lots of different stuff. Paper towels I put in here. Citrus. You can put citrus in your compost pile, but if you're doing large volumes of citrus, I probably would do it too much. Look at how interesting this is. See right there? That is a romaine. The bottom of a thing of romaine, and I threw it into my compost. Anyone see that fresh growth coming out the top? If you left that alone, that end of romaine is making roots. That romaine is going to be growing a new thing of romaine if I let it go. So again, this is the compost pile that I am currently adding to. This is not broken down. It needs more time to really finish breaking down all of the stuff that we're putting in it, but this is my newest compost. I think people can kind of go down a rabbit hole when it comes to composting and really get to thinking that it's more complicated than it actually is. Compost needs just a few things. Nitrogen-rich materials. When you think nitrogen, think about things that are green, like what I showed you in the pile, or what's in my pile, extra salad that we don't get through, the peelings of potatoes, things that were most recently fresh and not dried out. Banana peels, you can see in here, I've got the woody ends of asparagus. Those kind of things are nitrogen rich, and they're very, very important for your compost. They're the thing that really gets your compost super active and healthy. The other thing that you need is carbon rich materials. Carbon is things that are generally dried out. So when you think carbon, think about shredded newspaper or shredded paper. You can think also about adding leaves in the fall. In the fall is a great time to start either starting a compost pile or putting aside for a compost pile. There is no need to take all of those leaves that you get from your trees and put them out on the street for the garbage. Those leaves don't need to be disposed of. That is something that you can add to your compost. So in the fall, I definitely am like scrounging and grabbing leaves. If I have friends that have bagged leaves that they are gonna just throw out in the trash, I will go and pick them up. It is a great way to add carbon into your compost pile. So my rule of thumb generally is I do about 3/4 carbon rich things like leaves and paper and those kind of things to a 1/4 amount of nitrogen rich things, because that really does kind of balance out my compost. Now that is not something that you have to get out there with a measuring cup and think that it has to be that perfect. I just kind of like, as I'm putting a lot of things that have heavy nitrogen in it, if I'm putting a lot of scraps, if I'm putting a lot of like plants, even we will use our grass clippings if it hasn't been treated. If I'm putting a lot of that in there and that's high in nitrogen, I know that I really need to think about, oh, I need to add some things that are really high in carbon to kind of balance that out. So I just kind of keep that in mind. The chickens are mad about something. What's wrong, ladies? So compost also needs moisture. Moisture is really important for compost. I think in some areas it's not as big of a deal because you get a lot of rainfall, and so your compost will stay moist. I live in northern Nevada, which is high desert, so I'm in the mountains, but it's very, very dry. So in the summer, I actually have my Vegemahal, that's what I call this garden, on a drip system, and I have a little sprinkler off my drip system that waters down my compost so that it stays moist. The other thing that it needs is air. So it's really, really important sometimes to be turning your compost. Some people just do big heaps and then they just let it break down, which I tend to do. But this last year, I've had some problems with my compost, and I'm actually going to talk to you about that here in a little while. The problems that I've had and how I'm solving it. One of the ways that I'm solving it is to introduce more air into my compost. You can see here, my compost gets air on the side. This is one of the empty compost bins, and it has ways to have airflow from the sides. It's not just completely boxed in with a top on it. So with my compost, I have 3 bins for my compost. I have the bin that I'm currently working on. So this has the most recent additions to it. All goes into this one. This will get filled up all the way until it's at the very, very top. Once it's at the very, very top, I dump it into this next compost bin. This next compost bin is the second of my 3 compost bins, and this one is still breaking down. When I turn it from this one into this one, that turning helps add air to it, which does help break it down a little bit more. Really, all you're doing is you're making nutrients for your soil. So it'll go from this one into this one where it'll break down further. Generally, this one, as it breaks down, the heap gets smaller and smaller because all of those pieces are breaking down. So this fills up. Once this one fills up again, I will turn this one in the middle over to my last bin. And then I will turn that first compost into there. So it just kind of moves on down the line until it gets into this bin. By the time it's in this bin, it's very broken down. So in this compost bin, most of this I put back into my garden and then in the fall. So there's not that much in here. But as you can see, now this compost is broken down like soil, and this gets sprinkled over my garden. That's how I do my compost, is these 3 bin system, but I am producing a large quantity of compost every single year to serve my garden. It hasn't always been that way. My first garden as an adult was when I was a young married lady, and we had a small backyard in town. I definitely gardened there on a much smaller scale, and actually it was a very great tutor for me to have this bigger space, because that's where I really learned how to grow a lot of my plants closer together than what I had been traditionally taught, and it still worked out just as well. More on that later on in the YouTube channel, so make sure to like and subscribe so you can see other things that I can teach you and experiences that I've gleaned from gardening all of these years. When I was in town, I definitely didn't need as much compost as I need now. So what I did when I was in town was I had a compost bin very similar to the one that I'm showing you, that's all self-contained. It's something that you can put in the side yard or in the backyard inside these big barrels. So this is a compost bin that I picked up for free this last fall, and it is one that has these 2 big barrels with really great clasps on it that you can add your compost to. In here, you can see there's already some finished compost in there, but in this bin, you can add the leaves and the kitchen scraps like I had told you before, and this whole thing will rotate, so you can add a little bit of moisture. When you need moisture to it, you can rotate it. When I was in town and I had a compost bin like this, I found that it composted down much faster. I think for a couple reasons. I think that these stay really nice and heated up, the fact that they're up off the ground. I think that also the fact that you can rotate these and turn them, it keeps the compost really aerated. This is a really great solution for those of you guys who are in town. So it's not always necessary to have things on the scale that I have of compost bins. You can do them much smaller. Some people will get a big trash can, add all their compost that in there, and then just allow it to compost down like that. Don't feel that you can't compost if you have a smaller area. I add compost to my garden beds once a year. I make really good quality compost. Is in the fall. I take all of the compost that has been breaking down, that is ready and finished and small and broken down, and I put like 1 to 2 inches on top of all of my beds. So this last fall in this garden, in Scott's garden, I went through and I added compost to each of them. Let's see how it's broken down over the winter. So here's an example bed. You can see that this is light and fluffy. It has broken down materials in it, and this got 1 to 2 inches of compost in it in the fall. If you dig down into this garden bed, you will see that it is rich and dark and light and airy. Putting all of this compost in here in the fall, if it's not quite broken down 100%, over the winter it gets rained on, it gets snowed on, it breaks down, it feeds the soil, and it can finish composting the rest of the way. Why compost? Why is compost so important? It's really interesting when I really dig down to what I grow. the majority of what I do in my garden isn't growing vegetables. It is growing soil. The strength of my soil and the nutrient denseness in my soil in my garden is what is going to naturally grow my plants really big and healthy. So every single year, I spend a large amount of time on my compost. I spend a large amount of time amending my beds, making sure that I'm adding really good organic materials back to my beds, because then in turn, I'm able to organically and naturally grow my vegetables without having to add fertilizers. Compost is not fertilizer. Compost is building the structure and the microorganisms inside your soil. It is a living, breathing thing. There are microorganisms that are eating this down, breaking it apart, and making it richer and richer, which is making your garden stronger and stronger as you successively work on it. So there never goes a year that I'm not adding compost to my beds and making sure that they have no nutrition. If you are deciding to get healthy, one meal does not a nutritious and healthy person make. It's the consistency over time of fueling your body with the right things that are helping your cells grow to be stronger. That's just how it is with my garden beds. And that's a lot of what compost is. It's allowing nutrients to be fed back into your garden, and therefore the fruition of that is really healthy vegetables. Chickens do carry things that you don't really want on your vegetables in their droppings. So putting it into your compost pile and letting that break down will resolve the issue of the bacteria that you don't want up to next to your vegetables. I have a couple friends who have done really interesting compost where they do their compost bins straight in their compost piles straight in their chicken runs. So they put all of their scraps out there, they let their chickens do all the aerating, all the scratching up, they poop in there, and that's what they end up using as their compost. I think it's a really, really great idea. Another thing that I would love to get into eventually maybe is rabbits. Rabbit droppings are like the gold for compost and for putting on your plants. Rabbit droppings, from what I've heard, can go straight onto underneath your plants without burning, and the nutrient denseness of rabbit droppings is really great. So if you have a friend that has rabbits, you might ask them, can I have your poop? Because it's so dry in my area, especially during times where we haven't been getting rain, I get my hose out and I water my compost. Like I said, I'm building my soil, not just building vegetables. As I've shared with you before, this last year we expanded our garden by about double. By the fall, I'm gonna have enough compost in order to be able to amend all of my garden beds. Compost does take time. Usually it takes 6 to 9 months to finish a thing of compost, and I really only started building more compost in the fall. I am going to be using a local company to buy some compost because in the fall I was never able to amend the Veg Mahal where all my chickens are. I just pulled out my plants or let them eat the rest of the plants down in the fall, and I never amended those beds in the fall because I was out of compost. I used all the compost that I had made the previous year for Scott's garden. This weekend I am going to a company that I really am passionate about that makes really good quality local compost called Full Circle Compost, and I will be getting some compost for them that I'm going to be buying this spring in order to amend my raised bed garden, what we call the Veg Mahal. One thing that I wish that I would have done differently, when I finished those compost bins this last fall, I kind of had an idea that maybe if I covered my compost bins in black plastic and poked some holes in them so that moisture could get down into the compost bin, that my compost would break down faster. My hope was that by this spring, it would be so broken down that I would be able to amend that other garden bed and not incur the price of having to go and buy compost made by a company. But I really do think I didn't poke enough holes in it. So even though we had significant snowfall and rainfall that should have kept that compost bin wet, I don't think the black plastic over the top of it didn't have enough holes in it to really get enough moisture down into it. Now, would I try it again? Maybe. Maybe I would try it with the black plastic again, but there's a couple things I would do differently. I definitely would put more holes in it midwinter and water down my compost heap. But the black plastic should actually keep my compost hotter, and the hotter the compost, generally, the faster it will break down. It doesn't happen overnight, and it does take some time. Let's say that in January, you decide to start composting and you think that it's gonna be finished by April. Probably not gonna happen. So it does take some time, just as if I'm learning, you know, I went from having to make a smaller amount of compost to making a much larger amount of compost, but there is a lag time of like 6 to 9 months to make sure that it's all sufficiently finished. Again, just like if you're starting a compost bin right now, you have to wait the time out. I'm increasing the volume of which that I'm composting, so I have to wait the time. But homemade compost is always worth it. Thanks, friends, for joining me again for another episode. I love showing you guys how things are shaping up. The spring is a really, really busy time around the ranch. There's lots of gardening going on, new things going on with the animals, and it's just a really fun season of regeneration and sprouting and getting out into the sunshine after being stuck inside for so long. Please like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. It really benefits the channel and gets you informed as to what's going on around here. I'm encouraging you to get out there, get your hands in the soil, or maybe a little bit of homemade composting. This is Sarah at Twin Peaks Tradition, where the modern family is getting back to our traditional roots. Bye.